I want to get us started with our featured speaker for today. Our featured speaker is Dr. Mike Nguyen. Mike will be joining us virtually, so we will be navigating any questions or discussions in a hybrid fashion. As you all can see, in the front of the room, there are mics. We're more than welcome to walk the mics to you, but if you feel comfortable and you want to walk up to the mic, feel free to do so. Dr. Nguyen will actually see you. Dr. Nguyen is at a camera over there, so he will see the crowd. You can wave to him, say hi. So he will see you virtually. He will be on the main screen as well in just a bit. But before we have Dr. Nguyen join us, I would like to give a quick bio. So Dr. Mike Nguyen is an assistant professor at the University of Denver's Moorridge College of Education and faculty affiliate at the, and I will not pronounce correctly, Scrivener Institute of Public Policy and Interdisciplinary Research Institute for the Study of Inequality, in other words, IRISE. His research and teaching critically examines the benefits and consequences of racialized public policy instruments in expanding and or constraining educational systems, with a specific focus on how these dynamics shape access, learning opportunity, and success within and beyond schools for students of color. Dr. Nguyen aims to better articulate how race-conscious federal policy can reach its potential and fulfill its promise to address pervasive educational inequalities for underserved and underrepresented populations and regions within the United States. His work is supported by the organizations such as the Kresge Foundation and the APIA Scholars, and has been published in several outlets, including Educational Researcher, the Journal of Higher Education, and the Review of Higher Education. In addition to his academic work, Dr. Nguyen has extensive professional experience in federal government, having served as a senior staff member in the United States Congress. In his nearly 7 years of staff, Dr. Nguyen managed a wide-range portfolio and was responsible for multiple complex long-term intergovernmental projects and initiatives focusing on post-secondary education and the judiciary. Dr. Nguyen is deeply committed to applying his research to inform and advance public policy and institutional practice. And just to highlight, in 2021, he was appointed by the governor of Colorado to History, Culture, Social Contributions, and Civil Government and Education Commission. And in 2020, was appointed by the mayor of Denver to the Denver Asian American and Pacific Islander Commission. So with that being said, we're excited to have Dr. Mike Nguyen join us. Again, he will be joining us virtually. He will see you at that wonderful camera, so you can wave all you like, and then you'll see him on the main screen. So with that being said, I will pass it off to Dr. Nguyen.
Hi, everybody. I think you can all hear me. We did an audio check earlier. I see some waves. Thanks so much. Let me just start off by saying I'm sorry that I'm joining you all virtually. I was supposed to be there in person, but unfortunately I tested positive for COVID on Monday, and so unable to travel. And I will say, interestingly enough, Colorado is, out of all the states in the mainland, has the highest number of cases at the moment. So unfortunately, just adding to that statistic. But I'm grateful for everybody there that was able to, in really just a few days, convert my talk here from an in-person into a virtual Zoom version. So thank you to Andrew and to Diana and so many others for making this a possibility. So with that in mind, let me see if I can share my screen and share the presentation here. So hopefully you see my screen, and then you see the PowerPoint. Does everybody see that? I think so. Okay. And okay, I got a yes in the chat. Okay, good. So thank you again for having me join you today and doing so virtually. When I got asked to do this, I asked Wendy what do you want me to talk about, and she gave me a set of broad sort of themes that you're all sort of talking about today. And so I found a way to sort of weave them all together in a bit of a narrative. So hopefully some of this will be new and informative for you, and hopefully some of it will sort of confirm the things that you've been working on, and I hope that it will be beneficial for the work that you're all doing at UC San Diego. And so today's talk is the racialized experiences of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, supporting our A and HPI students in higher education. So before we sort of, I like to formally begin sort of all of our presentations with a land acknowledgement. And it's important to start this presentation by acknowledging the indigenous land that we are currently on, and recognize the traditional territories of where I am, the Arapaho, the Ute, and the Cheyenne peoples in Denver, of course, in the traditional homelands of the people of the Kumeyaay Nation in San Diego. Indeed, we recognize that all universities share a common history that is connected to the displacement of indigenous communities, which has eroded tribal nation sovereignty and forcibly assimilated Native individuals into US society. Thus, it is with much gratitude that we recognize their descendant communities and acknowledge that every member of the community has and continues to benefit from their lands. Today, Colorado and California are home to many different citizens of indigenous nations, and we recognize the enduring presence of indigenous peoples on this land, who are flourishing members of our local and our university communities. And so I invite you to keep this perspective not in the back of your mind, but in the front, particularly when considering the implications of this presentation on institutional practice, policy, and of course, advocacy. And so with that in mind, this presentation explores the racialized experiences of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islander students, and the institutional mechanisms that shape their differential experiences on campus. Through the use of disaggregated data, we're going to examine some stereotypical assumptions about AA and NHPI students and bring awareness to the disparities that are concealed about them. In doing so, this presentation offers some culturally relevant interventions to support our Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander college students. So normally, if we were all in person, I'd do a quick sort of field poll there and ask you all to raise your hands if you've heard of, who here has sort of heard of the model minority myth before. I can sort of see you all from a distant camera. I see a good amount, just about all the hands are up. So that's great, right? And everyone's probably seen this time cover from you know what, I think it's from the late 80s actually. And so just a quick review so we're all sort of on the same definition of the model minority myth, right? It's a common misconception that all Asian Americans are successful in an educational context, at least in the context we're talking about today. But of course, in reality, Asian American, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders are composed of very diverse communities that experience a wide range of educational barriers and outcomes. The diversity of migration histories, our experiences that connect to our contemporary and social economic conditions, and the educational opportunities that come from that. Certainly, some Asian Americans and some NHBIs have achieved success in higher education, while others face significant barriers that limit their educational opportunity. So in other words, there's a lot of diversity in educational outcomes within the larger Asian American category, and especially between and within Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, right? And so we sort of boil that down. These are some of the broad misconceptions that our communities often encounter, right? In fact, this is written by one of your own professors at UC San Diego, Sam Macias, who I don't know if he's there today, Sam. If you are, Sam, hi. And so Sam and Peter Keong argue that the model minority really offers sort of five, within an educational context, offers five broad misconceptions, right? One is that we're all the same. We're this, as Stacy Lee calls, a monolithic monotone. Two, that our communities are not really racial or ethnic minorities, or we're not minoritized. Three is that we don't encounter major challenges because of our race. Four, that we don't seek or don't require any resources or support. I know that's a big central theme of today, yesterday and today's convening, to sort of dispel that. And of course, five is that all the way that our communities view success is simply based on degree completion, right? And these are sort of five broad misconceptions. But as I said earlier in the previous slide, our communities are unbelievably diverse, right? So you look at sort of just standard census categories, you can see within the broader Asian American Pacific Islander, the way we're sort of lumped together, often historically for political reasons. But if you consider the federal state-based classifications of race, Asian Americans are a separate racial category from Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, actually through advocacy in the late 90s and early 2000s. And so, but once you break those two categories up, you can see that there's a host of ethnicities that fall under these two racial groups, right? So very, very, very diverse community. These are just the ones that the census reports out traditionally, right? We know there's actually many, many more ethnic communities, and within these ethnic communities are very, additionally very diverse experiences relating to history of arrival in the United States, different types of immigration history, social economic status, et cetera, and sort of the intersection of all of those things in other identities, right? But if we just sort of use these census-based categories and start thinking about educational attainment, what we see is we get a chart like this. This is based off census data that shows on one side high school, those who have a high school diploma or less, and then on the other side, a bachelor's degree or higher. And you can see within these sort of ethnic categories, there is a huge diversity and huge range, right? That can often be concealed, and if these categories are merged together into simply an Asian American Pacific Islander category, we can see a lot of this data get concealed. And what you'll see here is there's some common trends, right? Is that those, for instance, those who identify as Southeast Asian American, I'm talking about at the top there, your Lao, your Cambodian, your Hmong, your Vietnamese folks. There's a reason why some of those numbers are much lower than other groups, and that has to do with their collective and shared refugee experience in the United States. And so considering sort of the complexity and diversity of our communities is so critical in understanding all of these types of outcomes, such as educational attainment, as well as many others, right? So if we sort of apply this logic to UC San Diego, what do we see? First is we can take a look at sort of UCSD's undergraduate enrollment by race, right? And if we combine Asian Americans all together, and this is in 2021 enrollment data, you can see, wow, it looks like Asian Americans are doing really, really good. There's 18,000, over 18,000 Asian American undergraduates at UC San Diego, far exceeding all of these other racial groups, right? But if we disaggregate this data, we can see that there's, again, huge variation within the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, where in some cases there's some ethnic groups have a very high enrollment, while others have very, very, very little enrollment. So for instance, look at, there's only 10 Tongan undergraduates on campus. And on the other hand, there's some 2,000, almost some 2,500 Vietnamese American students on campus. And then of course, there are some groups that are just the university combines just because, I'm assuming what they would say is because those numbers are so small. So you have another Asian American category there at 319, and you've got another Pacific Islander category at 57. But you can see again, there's huge variation and diversity in terms of enrollment. And this chart sort of is quite similar to almost maps evenly to that educational attainment chart that I had earlier, right? And so it's important for us to continue to use this level of data for our communities in order for us to get a better snapshot of where our students are at, right? So in addition to sort of the actual demographics, or what we call the compositional dimension of the campus, and knowing, right, that the model minority myth is a harmful stereotype, as well as that Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander students are not are so diverse. How do we sort of capture their differing experiences on campus, right? There's a wonderful set of frameworks that we can use to to give us a lens to begin to interpret what's happening on campus. I like to use the multidimensional model for diverse learning environments, the MMDLE, for a lot of reasons. It can capture the diverse experiences of our communities, as well as other communities of color on a college campus. And it does so across 5 dimensions, right? The first one is the compositional dimension, which we talked about earlier, the demographics, the numerical demographics on a college campus, right? We can see that if you aggregate up Asian Americans, they seem to be the plurality of students on campus. But once you disaggregate, you can see there's huge and varying numbers, and in some cases, many students are compositionally quite underrepresented. Now, with that in mind, there are other dimensions that we have to consider if we really want to develop a campus environment that is supportive for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander students to thrive, right? And this is especially true for our students in some cases, because we often hear the argument that because their numbers are so large on campus, we don't really need to worry about them, right? This framework allows us to begin to sort of interrogate that logic and that thinking, and it lets us sort of uncover that to show that it's actually quite far, that statement is quite far from the truth, right? And so we turn to these other dimensions to better understand what's going on. So this includes the organizational dimension, right? It's how the institution is structured and how it operates. The behavioral dimension, how people on campus interact with one another. The psychological dimension, so that's what people on campus feel and think and believe. And then of course the historical dimension, which is how the institution existed prior to what it is today, right? The historical origins of it. And so these 5 dimensions help us think about multiple areas, including the campus racial climate, and provides us with the additional criteria and metrics to assess and to evaluate student experiences on campus, particularly regarding how Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander students are racialized on campus. It tells us that in addition to the misrepresentation of Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander students and the types of schools that they attend, as well as their achievements, we know that these students face real racism on campus, right? We've seen these incidences and experienced them for ourselves. Some of us have, and certainly I'm one of those folks who've experienced it as a student. By the way, I'm a product of the UC system. All of my degrees are from UC schools, and so I know full well sort of what, from a personal experience, what it's like being an Asian American student on campus. But of course, it tells us that, that these are not, these examples I've shown here are not just these sort of racist examples that happened at UC campuses are not just isolated incidents, right? And that it's probably happening more than it's being reported. And so what does that sort of all of that, what does sort of all of that mean, right? And so what we did here is for example, we conducted a disaggregated mixed method study of the racialized experiences of AA and NHPI students at a UC school where AA and NHPI students comprise of over 30% of the campus population, right? So over a third of the student population, certainly the plurality of students on campus identified as AA and HPI. And the findings were really revealing, indicated that despite comprising of such a large population of the entire undergraduate student body, Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander students shared so many difficult similarities and experiences with other communities of color. In our analysis across racial group experiences, for example, we find that AA and HPI students' experiences are much more parallel to other racial and ethnic minority students than their white peers, which of course is all too commonly, that notion is all too commonly used in most of the higher education research. This point is demonstrated in this figure on 2 indicators, right? One is that sense of belonging, and the other is satisfaction with students' academic experiences. So on a 6-point scale, right, with 1 being strongly disagree and 6 equaling strongly agree, API students note that their level of agreement of feeling like they belong on campus is much closer to Black and Latinx students, and significantly lower than white students. This is even more prominent. You can even see this even more prominent in the gold bars there that represent satisfaction with academic experiences, where Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander students indicate that they have the lowest rates lowest rates across all groups, right? And so, although the average response across all groups is generally high, right? It's around 4 and change across the 6-point scale. I think the findings here are important in that they demonstrate that this idea of a highly satisfied, highly achieving AAPI student population is far from true, right? It also critically shows that research and programs that collapse begins for us to get us to think about that by collapsing them, Asian American students with white students, as we see all too common in especially quantitative higher education research, to build this sort of notion of quote unquote honorary white is really unrepresentative of AAPI experiences and highly problematic. And so there's a lot, much more that we have to sort of understand about our students, their experiences and their needs. So given that need, right, we conducted analyses, disaggregated analyses by ethnic subgroups and found really interesting intergroup disparities with regard to their experiences. So in this figure here on dissatisfaction with academic and social experiences on campus, for example, we see that Southeast Asian American students, so that's all the way to your far left there, are disproportionately likely to be dissatisfied with their overall academic experience at nearly 32% compared to South Asians, East Asians, or Filipino students. This same sentiment is true for perceptions of overall social experiences as fewer, but still disproportionately higher rates of Southeast Asians report dissatisfaction. Right? I think these findings are really important for thinking about how institutions can best support AA and HPI students, overall, and of course, in fact, in fact, it shows that they face really different levels of unique challenges, right? It also highlights the importance of utilizing disaggregated data to better understand our AAPI student experience. And then from that, we can build targeted interventions that can support their success, their well-being on campus, particularly for groups that are underrepresented and underserved, right? Sort of looking overall at satisfaction with campus climate, you can see again that there's huge differences between subgroups, and with Southeast Asians reporting some of the lowest levels on campus compared to their counterparts, right? But if you look at these two gold bars that run across from left to right, you can see that that if you were to combine these groups into one, it looks like all Asian Americans are doing really well, just a tad bit lower, 0.05 lower than the campus average. And so, but really, once you disaggregate, you can see that there's huge differences between groups. And so, what does all this mean, right? It means that, one, data disaggregation matters if you want to understand the Asian American, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander student population on your campus, right? Without doing so, we would not understand the lack of differences, the complexities of student experiences across subgroups, as well as that in some cases, they're indicators regarding their sense of belonging, their feelings on campus, their well-being range and have dramatic range, right? The qualitative results via the study also reinforce these findings, right? Students felt that their ethnic identities were lost in the shuffle as the campus would view them as one monolithic group, or worse, actually assume that they were identified with a different ethnic identity. This, of course, led to students feeling unbelievably invisible and alone on their college campuses. Participants also described what they perceived to be insufficient commitment and support from the university around diversity, but specifically around issues connecting to their own sort of ethnic identities and ethnic backgrounds, right? So while a lot of the messaging might be about supporting Asian American Pacific Islander students, oftentimes that gets diluted when sort of not being able to focus specifically on certain groups and the experiences of those particular subgroups. And so with all of these challenges in mind, right, what institutions are there institutions that are doing work in building positive campus environments that are serving Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander students across all of these dimensions, right? Knowing sort of what the problems are, particularly when we can disaggregate the data. I'm an optimistic person, and I would say that we can turn to one really wonderful example of some institutions that are doing some incredibly innovative work in order to support their Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander students. These are one of the newest MSI, Minority Serving Institution designations, called ANAPESES. I would love to, again here I would ask, hey, raise your hand if you've heard of what ANAPESES are. I'm trying to look into I can see a couple hands. So am I safe to say that, that just about everyone raised their hand when we talked about model minority myth, but less folks have heard of what an ANAPESE is? Is that right? I think that's right. Okay, at least from what I can see on my screen here. So first off, there are, I think a lot of us have heard of of HBCUs and Hispanic serving institutions, right? Those are maybe some of in tribal colleges, those might be the three sort of most well-known minority serving institutions or MSI designations within the sort of federal suite administered by the US Department of Education. In fact, there's actually 11 different MSIs. You can see them all here. And with ANAPESES, which stands for Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander Serving Institutions. It's a bit of a mouthful of an acronym compared to some of the other MSIs. And so if you ever have a hard time trying to say it, think of it like a person's name, where the person's first name is Anna and their last name is Peasy, so ANAPESE. And so with the establishment of the ANAPESE designation by Congress in 2007, you can see that it provides federal funding for colleges and universities that meet the requirements to be an ANAPESE. It then allows for that funding to be used for targeted programming for a particular student population on campus. And I think sort of it signals a federal commitment to communities of color, in this case, Asian American Pacific Islander students and their higher education needs. So, okay, here we go. So as I said earlier, this is one of the newest MSI designations. It was established by Congress in 2007, so it's about 15 years old today, right? Unlike HBCUs or tribal colleges, and more similar to Hispanic serving institutions, HSIs, colleges and universities are funded as ANAPESES through a competitive grant, typically consisting of a 5-year cycle, right? So it is not like an HBCU or tribal college that receives funding all of them receive funding from the federal government every year. Instead, ANAPESES are like HSIs, where the school must apply for federal funding, a competitive grant, and if awarded, would then receive a set amount of dollars over a 5-year period, right? The Department of Education outlines 2 main goals, really, quite simply, one could argue, for what ANAPESES are supposed to do, right? One is to increase college access, and 2 is to increase persistence through retention programs, right? Now, how does a school become an ANAPESE? Per the federal government, there's actually only 2 primary criteria. The first is having a 10% undergraduate Asian American Pacific Islander enrollment, right? So 10% of the undergraduate student population must identify as AAPI. And then 2, must meet Section 312B of the Higher Education Act, right? And so what is that? What is, the first one's pretty easy to understand, 10%, got it, right? The second one, what is Section 312B? Well, it's unbelievably complicated. This is actually pretty much what Section 312B is summarized, right? In the HEA. And so you can see it's unbelievably complicated. And I stress this, and I intentionally put this slide up with all of this language and text, because too often in the higher education research and literature, particularly on anaphysies, you'll see a lot of folks write that this requirement, an institution must have 50% Pell eligible students. This is not exactly accurate. While that is actually a part of, that can be used as one of the metrics for what you see here in this, in the third bullet point there, have a requisite enrollment of needy students. It's not the only criteria, right? There's actually a series of other really important criteria. So I really want to sort of get, I want to get everyone here on the bandwagon where we stop using that 50% Pell as the second requirement to become an ANAPESI. Instead, more accurately reflect what it is, which is Section 312B. And the reason why that's important, right, is because let's say your institution doesn't meet all these requirements. In other words, UC San Diego may not meet all of these requirements as outlined in Section 312B. There's actually a caveat to this section, which is that a school can apply for a federal waiver for a host of different rationales and reasons if they don't meet some of these, all of these requirements, right? And so in the case of UC San Diego, UC Riverside, UC Irvine, UC Santa Cruz, UC Santa Barbara, UC Davis, almost all of our UC schools don't meet the second requirement, which is have a lower than average educational and general expenditure. For a lot of different reasons. One, California is a high cost of living state, so expenditures tend to be higher. A lot of these UC schools have medical schools, which then bring up expenditures. And so it sort of throws that formula out of whack. So I know for a fact that UC San Diego, as well as all the other UCs that have applied for this waiver, have been approved for it, and thus actually are waived out of meeting Section 312B, and then can become an eligible ANAPESI. So with that in mind, right, if we look historically, there have been some 217 colleges that have been identified as eligible ANAPESIs since this program was created in 2007, right? So essentially meeting both of those requirements, or in some cases, some schools waiving out of that second requirement, but still having the 10% AAPI enrollment, right? As of right now, there are 192 institutions that are currently eligible, including UC San Diego as a currently eligible institution. Overall, some 50 institutions have been funded under the ANAPESI designation. And then right now, at this current moment, there are 30 schools that are currently receiving funding from the Department of Education as an ANAPESI, right? So why do we have to sort of think about ANAPESIs in a much more nuanced way like this, rather than simply just saying, rather than sort of generalizing it all, right? Because there's actually, these different statuses mean different things. One, the two on the right means that you've received funding from the federal government, while interestingly enough though, applying for that waiver and becoming an eligible ANAPESI as your school, as San Diego has done, is also critically important, because the last 3 federal stimulus packages that came out, I'm talking about the CARES Act, the CRRSA, as well as the American Rescue Plan. All 3 of those pieces of legislation had provisions in it for extra funding for MSIs. And so if you were an eligible MSI, in this case, you are an eligible ANAPESI, you would have received actually additional federal funding because of that eligibility status. And so that's why I keep saying to as many schools as possible, even if you meet the enrollment criteria, the 10%, and you may not meet the Section 312B, you should apply for a waiver, because and you have to actually do this every year. It's usually around December or January of every year. So someone on campus needs to apply for this waiver every year, because doing so means that one of the benefits is that when there's federal funding that comes out, your school could be automatically qualified to receive that funding. The other thing is, across the federal bureaucracy and various federal agencies, like the Department of the Interior, the NSF, NIH, National Endowment for the Humanities, they actually have specific MSI initiatives that allow you to either apply for those additional funds, those MSI specific grant opportunities, or receive extra points on a federal grant application because of your MSI status. And so being currently eligible gives you that status. And so there's just a host of really wonderful benefits to qualify and become an eligible ANAPESI or an eligible MSI, like the way UC San Diego has. Okay, so I just want to give some sort of some quick descriptive statistics on ANAPESIs, right? And so you can see that across 2-year institutions as well as 4-year institutions, enrollment, AA and HPI enrollment at these institutions has dramatically increased, right, over time. You can see that more and more AA and HPI students are attending ANAPESIs across the United States and in the Pacific. You can also see that really, even though they comprise of only about 5% of all institutions in the United States, they're enrolling just about 40% of all AA and HBI undergraduate students in the United States. So really a small number of schools are enrolling a large number of our students, our AA and HBI students. So they're highly concentrated, right? And then you can see here, and not just enrollment, you can see that they are responsible for large numbers of degree attainment of our students, right? So you can see across associate's degrees and bachelor's degree, over time, a really large increase in degrees conferred at ANAPESIs. And so, as I mentioned earlier, right, there's sort of 2 broad classifications for ANAPESIs: schools that meet eligibility requirements as UC San Diego does, and then once you meet those eligibility requirements, you can apply for a federal grant. And if you're awarded a grant, what does that mean, right? We typically then call those schools funded ANAPESIs, and those institutions often establish an ANAPESI program on campus. So what are ANAPESI programs? Well, they typically are organized in 3 and deliver sort of services in 3 different areas. First is sort of academic and student support services. The second is leadership and mentorship opportunities. And third is they oftentimes produce research, provide resources for research, as well as, broadly speaking, resource development. We can learn a lot from what they're doing, right? With respect to academic and student support services, ANAPESIs often structurally include or collaborate with Asian American Studies programs on their campus. We all know that, and not just sort of personally, but empirically, it's been demonstrated that Asian American Studies is critical in developing environments for students that enhance a wide variety of academic success, as well as psychosocial benefits like enhancing their sense of belonging and their engagement on campus. So there are schools, for instance, like De Anza College up in the Bay Area, have found ways to integrate, and this is a community college, by the way, that have found ways to integrate Asian American Studies programming with all of their STEM offerings. And in doing so, by doing so, they set up faculty learning communities of Asian American Studies faculty and STEM faculty to work together to help redesign that curriculum. That's what they use some of their resources for. ANAPESIs also offer leadership and mentorship opportunities, both on campus and in their local communities. So we've seen high school outreach programs and community college transfer programs where students themselves are engaged in this work. Many often returning to their own high schools or the community colleges in which they transferred from to help with that transfer process. Student affairs professionals and faculty have developed courses and programs to bring academic learning to practice through internships, as well as meetings and community tours with community-based organizations, and in some cases with elected officials and policymakers. And finally, ANAPESIs have engaged in research and resource development to expand the knowledge base of ANAPESIs overall, right? So for instance, UMass Boston has set up a special grant where they sort of sub-grant out some of that funding in order to, for folks to do studies connected to ANAPESIs to build that ANAPESI research base. So what does all this mean, right? I think different segments of the Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander student population experiences they experience higher education differently, particularly as ethnic groups have dramatically different experiences in enrollment, representation, faculty, and staff, and among so many others, right? So what we know from that is that, especially from the early part of this presentation, is that compositional diversity alone cannot be used, cannot alone be used to sort of understand the AA and HBI student on campus, right? We have to recognize the complexity and diversity within our populations, and the harm of the model minority myth by shedding light on their unique challenges. So the need to interrogate student interactions beyond sort of cross-racial interaction, but in refined directions that complicate how we traditionally consider and investigate racial interactions. So thinking about inter-ethnic, and interracial relations are really important for our AA and NHBI communities, particularly across different types of settings and situations. And so we need to develop targeted interventions to specifically address the experiences of Southeast Asians, Pacific Islanders, and Filipinx students, and educate our broader campus community about their diversity and complexity. So in other words, we need to collect and utilize disaggregated data, and we can look to the efforts of folks doing that work at Anapizis, right, who are already doing this work and probably doing some of the most innovative work in all of these areas. And so with all that in mind, given UC San Diego's status now as an eligible Anapizi, it means you can do a series of important things. One, which is collaborate with other Anapizis, particularly funded Anapizis in the area. For instance, San Diego Mesa College is actually one of the newest and most recently funded Anapizis in the country, but also just down the road from you all, right? It also means that that you can engage in what is currently being developed as a UC Anapizi initiative. This is just something that's in the works, and a couple campuses are starting to sort of meet about this, and so I think I know that UC San Diego has this is a wonderful opportunity for you all to engage in this initiative and learn from and collaborate with them to build out your Anapizi work on campus. And then eventually, of course, in 4 years, because remember they're on 5-year cycles, in 4 years, apply for the next Anapizi grant. Get all of your ducks in a row, that way when the grant application comes up and that very short 60-day window comes up, you're ready to go and, to apply for that very complex and large federal grant. So sort of with all those implications in mind, right, it's important to think about all of this in a broader national context. So what we know is that we've seen nearly a 340% increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans over this past year, right? Data from a nationally representative longitudinal study shows that in 2022, this year, Americans overall are more likely to blame Asian Americans for COVID-19. As you can see here, that's a huge jump just from 2021, last year, when the nationally representative sample was at 11%, right? So nearly a double in jump from one year to the next. The same study shows that Americans are more likely to question the loyalty of Asian Americans in the United States. Again, a huge jump from 20% last year to 32% this year. These are really serious national problems that without a doubt trickle into higher education, right? And without a doubt, our students are experiencing this on our college campuses. And so when we think about, I had made this slide last month for you all. So when we think about supporting and serving our A and HBI students, we need to remind ourselves that we're not monolithic, we're not universally successful, not everyone's well-adjusted and satisfied with their college experiences. A rationale often used to exclude our communities from campus conversations regarding academic success, diversity, ethnic representation, and our racial climate, right? Instead, we need to think about the complexity, diversity, and the beauty in Asian American and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities when we engage in this work. And so thank you so much for having me. I hope some of this was helpful for you in thinking about ways to serve our communities, and I would love to be able to engage in a dialogue and discussion with you all. Let me stop sharing my screen. And hopefully we can chat a little bit.
Thank you, Dr. Nguyen. Hopefully you can hear us. Just wanted to share, we appreciate you, and we'll definitely take one or two questions. If you all, just wanted to let you know there is a follow-up session with Dr. Nguyen as well in this room. But for the larger group, if there's a question or two you would like to ask for the large group, we can hand it off. Anyone interested in asking a question or two or making a thought?
Thank you for that great presentation. And I was looking at the acronym, the ANAPISI acronym, and looking at all of the MSI, the 11 MSI potentials. And I noticed that it's Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander serving institution. And I thought, is it actually referencing Native Hawaiian? Is that what they're trying to indicate? Or are they thinking of what we often think of as our tribal communities?
Great question. Thank you so much for asking that. I so appreciate you asking this question because it is unbelievably confusing, and this sort of shows you the that Congress is not all-knowing when designing legislation. And I like to say that because I used to work there. And so this is actually a really interesting thing. If you look at the original if you sort of track the history of ANAPISIs over time, right? It actually was initially introduced as simply Asian American and Pacific Islander serving institutions. And then over time, as the bill was reintroduced, it became Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander serving institutions. And that was sort of the most recent iteration as it was moving through the legislative process. And then as the bill actually was being consolidated into a larger education, higher ed bill, right, being slid in, its name changed in a Senate conference meeting from Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander to Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander. And in this meeting, it was just a group of senators. If you look at, you can actually track historically to see which senators were in that meeting. And this is when Senator Clinton was still a senator, Senator Obama was in that meeting, then Senator Obama. So this was some time ago, right? And so I would have loved to have been a worm or a fly on the wall to figure out how and why the name changed in that room of about 20 to 30 senators. So I have not been able, I don't think any of us have been able to track down why that name changed. This is what we do know. We know two things. One, which is that there is already another type of MSI called the Alaska Native and Native Hawaiian serving institution. So we think that because that other MSI already existed, one specifically for Native Hawaiians, they changed the name from Native Hawaiian to Native American. So we think that's the reason why the name changed. But if you actually, in addition to that, if you look at the statute, federal statute, Native American Pacific Islander does not mean that it is intended to serve our tribal or indigenous students on the college campus. So in fact, if you look up the ANAPISI statute in the Higher Education Act, it will say Native American, it'll say, quote, Native American Pacific Islander stands for, represents, and then it will list sort of all the territories in the Pacific. And so this is a really confusing thing where oftentimes I think if you just look at the name alone, you'll think, oh, this is great. It's a program to serve indigenous students on campus, which I think is a good. We should be certainly serving indigenous students, but because of I guess the infinite wisdom of Congress, they had to confuse us with this name change in the last minutes before when they sort of incorporated this into a larger bill and passed it into law. So hopefully that answers your question and gives you a little bit of history on sort of the name and why it's so confusing.
Thank you so much for your response, Dr. Nguyen. If you all have any other questions, we do have a featured speaker session following this. So again, Please join me giving a round of applause for Dr. Nguyen.